I don't have a traditional emergency fund, and I don't think that you should either. And if you don't know who I am, my name is Nick True, and I've worked with over 1,000 clients to improve their finances and help them get ahead with their money. And one of the first things that I do when I'm working with a new client is I end up completely destroying this idea of a traditional emergency fund. Here's how this typically goes. We get on a call and they share their screen and we start taking a look at their bank account structure. Inevitably, they have some sort of vague account that's just called savings, and it has some money in it, and maybe there's some transfers going back and forth. And I ask them, what's the money in your savings account for? And I often get some blank stares. Sometimes they'll say things like, well, it's savings. Duh. And I go, yeah, no, I get that, but what are you planning to buy with your savings? Now, sometimes I'll actually get a little bit more than that, and they'll say, well, it's my emergency fund. And I say, okay, great. Well, what constitutes an emergency? And if they didn't get blank stares before, I definitely get them here because they go, well, I mean, emergencies, as if that's such an obvious thing. And when I push them on it a little bit further to define what is an emergency for you, what constitutes finally taking money out of the emergency fund? Well, now I get a whole list of vague answers, and you can tell very quickly they don't actually have a game plan for how and when they can take money out of that account. And that's one of the reasons, quite frankly, that most people's emergency funds never end up growing because, well, when anything can become an emergency, like your favorite store having a flash sale and it's an emergency because if you don't buy something tonight before the sale ends, well, then you're out of luck. It was an emergency. When those things can become emergencies, then you have no shot of being able to actually save this money. And that's when I explain that the idea of a traditional emergency fund, I don't think is actually beneficial for most people. But first, let me define a traditional emergency fund. Typically, this is 3 to 6 months of living expenses saved up in some sort of savings account, ideally a high yield savings account, and people throw money into it at the end of every single month, whatever they can. And ideally, we're going to grow this over time and one day eventually reach this miraculous place of having 3 to 6 months of living expenses saved up. But more often than not, like I just explained, most people end up pulling from this account for any manner of unexpected expenses long before it reaches that 3 to 6 months. And that's the issue. When the emergency fund is unclearly defined as some sort of vague emergency that happens and you don't have an explicit reason for when you can touch that money, you end up grabbing at it for any number of reasons. Now, obviously, I'm not advocating that you just forego any type of savings for emergencies. That's not what I'm saying at all. That's not what I do, and it's not what I recommend my clients do. Instead, what I prefer to do is to think about the specific types of emergencies that are most likely to occur for you as an individual, and then create a category and saving structure for those specific emergencies. I do this because when you label the category, the savings as something highly specific, you are way less likely to actually take money out of it for things that are not that category. The other reason that I like this approach is that for many people, they will inadequately save for some emergencies while over saving for other emergencies. And when we break down the different items that could most likely throw you off, we can better plan for those based on your specific scenario. Let me break this down and show you exactly what I mean. There are 4 big emergencies that typically throw most people off. First is auto maintenance, then home maintenance, then medical expenses, and this could be for humans in your household or pets in your household. And then the fourth, and this is the main one people think of, is income loss. That's actually where the 3 to 6 months of living expenses come from. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's break down each one of these 4 and give you some questions to think about as it relates to these 4 items and how to determine how much of an emergency fund you should start saving for. But before I do that, I want to practically show you what this looks like. So I use a budgeting tool called YNAB. It's short for You Need a Budget to manage my money as well as help my clients manage theirs. And I create individual categories that represent these items. And so this is an example category structure of what a budget could look like. And you'll notice that I have home maintenance, auto maintenance, medical emergency as individual categories with targets where I'm saving every single month for these items. And then down below here, I also have an income loss fund where, again, I'm saving a set amount every single month for that particular emergency. And this is helpful because if an emergency comes up, I know that I don't just have some vague emergency fund that I'm pulling from. I can actually go and look at that particular emergency, whether it was a medical or a maintenance or auto maintenance or whatever it is, and I can look at that particular category and see if I have any money available or if I'm going to end up having to pull from other places in order to deal with this emergency. And so from a practical standpoint, I do actually have one specific bank account that might have all of this money in it, but I'm using YNAB to differentiate what that money is for. And so in order to make a decision, I'm never looking at the bank account to decide, can I do this or can we afford this or do we have money for that emergency? Instead, I'm coming in here and looking at YNAB whenever an emergency happens to see how we're going to deal with it. Now, let's get back to the specific types. So the first, like I said, is auto maintenance. Depending on your situation, you should be saving very little or you should be saving a lot. You want to ask questions like, how old are the vehicles that you own? Are you leasing them? Because if you're leasing them, well, then you've got the lease payment, but you don't have a lot of maintenance. However, if you own it and it's really, really old, like the cars that my wife and I drive, then you better be saving a healthy amount every single month because stuff is going to break down. Let's not be surprised when it does. In addition to asking how old the car is, you want to think about how expensive is this car to work on. Is this a brand where whenever I take it in the shop, it's $1,000 every single time, no matter what? If so, we need to be making sure that we are saving a healthy amount. And again, not be surprised. This is one of the most common pushback I get all the time from people is they'll say, well, I just can't budget because I don't know when things are going to happen. I mean, last month the car broke down. This month my kid got sick. The next month it could be who knows. And it's like, well, hold up. You own a car, right? Yeah. The car has how many miles on it? 75,000. Okay, so are we really going to be surprised when a car has to get an oil change? No. Should we really be surprised when a car breaks down? No. Should we really be surprised when our two twin 16-year-old sons both get their driver's license and one of them drives over the mailbox? No, we shouldn't be surprised. So you want to think about how old are the cars, how expensive are they to work on, and do you have people in your household that are likely to cause an auto maintenance issue? If so, then we should be planning accordingly. You will be surprised when it happens, but we shouldn't be surprised that it happens. And therefore, we should have a plan to save for that item. The next one, like I said, is home maintenance. Now, this one is very similar to auto maintenance. You want to ask, how old is the home? When was the last time some of the major things were done to it? And that should help us set a monthly amount that we can be saving for just home maintenance. If you have no clue where to start and you do own a home, I found that somewhere between 1% and 2% of the home's value per year can be a helpful starting point. So if you had a $300,000 house, for example, you would look at 1% of that, which is $3,000 per year. Divide that number by 12. I don't do public math, but what is that? $250 a month? Boom, $250 a month. $250 a month is what I would be setting aside as a starting point. Now, if I ever start to build up a significant amount of money, well, then maybe I can back that off. But I would start with saving 1% to 2% of your home's value per year as a good starting point. One other option for the super nerds out there, if you're like super into budgeting and you got all this stuff dialed in, is to actually break down your home by the major systems. And so that means having a dedicated category for the water heater, the HVAC, the roof, and then if your home's like really old and you know that one day you're going to have to like upgrade all the electrical or replace the cast iron pipes or something like that, then you could have, dedicated categories for those if you wanted. Bottom line, home maintenance shouldn't be an emergency. We know that homes break. We know that systems fail. We shouldn't be surprised that it happens. We'll be surprised when it happens, not that it happens. And so that means we should have a plan to save for these items. One last thought on home maintenance here is that home decor and home furnishings and desirable upgrades, right? Renovations those are not home maintenance. And so if you are planning for any of those things or you do any of those things, you need to make sure that you have separate categories in your budget, separate money that you're allotting for those things. All right, next on our list is medical expenses. Now, medical, again, is going to be highly specific to your unique situation. So think about what season in life are you in? Do you have a lot of little kids running around that are constantly getting sick and you're having to go to the doctor and get copays and prescriptions and different medicines? Well, you might want to have a heftier monthly amount for saving for medical. On the flip side, if you're relatively young and healthy and don't have a lot going on, you can probably lower this amount. On the other extreme, maybe you know that you've got so much stuff going on that you pretty much hit your medical deductible every single year, and you're going to hit that out-of-pocket maximum that your insurance requires. If that's you, you probably need to treat this like an annual expense, the same way that you might plan for Christmas savings or a big vacation. You have a category in your budget and a plan to save the full out-of-pocket maximum every single year. I do think regardless of whether or not you are sickly or super healthy, you should plan to eventually save up the full amount of your insurance deductible. This is especially true if you're on a high deductible plan like my wife and I. Although we are relatively young and fairly healthy, these days we do have a very high deductible. It's $11,000 that we have to pay out of pocket before the insurance kicks in. And while most of the time we're safe, we did end up hitting that deductible last year, which was not fun at all and made me really grateful that we had that worked into the budget. The bottom line with medical expenses is you want to think about the ongoing kind of month-to-month stuff for the season that you're in, and then specifically making sure that you are setting aside some money to eventually have the full deductible ready to go in case of an extreme emergency. So at this point, we've taken care of auto maintenance, home maintenance, and medical, which again, you should think about the pet medical and human medical in your household. Well, if we've taken care of those big three, then the only real major emergency left is income loss. And this one, again, is highly subjective. The typical advice is 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses, and that typically is thrown around because that is the average amount of time that someone in the US is on unemployment. But this can vary wildly depending on what part of the country you live in, what you do for a living, and how in demand your skill set is. And so you shouldn't just take the 3 to 6 months at face value. Instead, you should go one step beyond that and think about your specific situation. Here's a few questions that I like to ask. The first is, how likely are you to get laid off? If you're a tenured professor and you've been in your, at your university for decades and decades, it is highly unlikely that you're going to lose your income. On the flip side, if you are a brand new employee at a AI startup that is not really sure that they're going to make their next round of funding, good shot, you might get laid off, right? And so the first question we're going to ask is, how likely is it that you're laid off? And depending on what you answer, we might want to beef up our emergency savings for this, or we can ratchet it down. The next question would be, how quickly could I replenish my income if I were to get laid off? Is the skill set that you offer, whatever your career is it in super high demand right now? And if you did get laid off, you could go find another job tomorrow? Or are you in an industry where actually I've got friends that are getting laid off and they're sitting out of work for a long, long time. They're having a really hard time finding work because the demand is lower and the supply is huge. There's tons of people that do what I do. And so it might actually be difficult for me to find a replacement job. The third question you might want to ask is, if you were to lose all your income overnight, how quickly or how easily can you ratchet down your spending? Do you have a lot of fixed bills that ultimately make up 60, 70, 80% of your income between fixed bills and necessary needs like groceries? If so, well, then you don't have a lot of wiggle room. On the flip side, if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of fixed bills and most of your spending is pretty discretionary and has a lot of wiggle room, and if you were to get laid off, you could really cut your spending pretty aggressively, well, then you might not need as big of an emergency fund because you can just cut your spending down and last a whole lot longer. If we take all of this into account, we can come up with a few different scenarios, right? If you are a young, single, 20-something with very, very low fixed bills, nobody else is responsible for you, and you have a fairly stable job with an in-demand skill set, well, good grief. You maybe need a month, month and a half worth of emergency money, and then you could get really aggressive and just invest the rest of your money rather than holding it in cash in an income loss savings account. On the flip side, let's say that you are a business owner with highly irregular income. I'm using an extreme example here, and you sell kids' toys for a living, and you do 90% of your sales between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and you have a family that relies on you. Well, in this case, I would literally encourage this person to eventually save up 12 months of an emergency fund. Because if you have one bad holiday season, you're hosed for the entirety of the next year as you prepare for the next holiday season. And I know this sounds like a crazy example, but I've come across people that are in these types of situations. And so for that person, they are saving way too little by only saving up a 3-month emergency fund. Whereas for the single 20-something with the in-demand skill set, they're saving too much, and they would be better off taking that money and investing it and putting that money to work rather than leaving it sitting in a checking or savings account. The point here is this. Rather than just having some generic savings account with the word emergency sort of labeled onto it, we want to think about the specific emergencies that might happen in your life. Although they feel unexpected in the moment, we can actually plan and expect a number of these if we just sit down and think about it for a few minutes ahead of time. This will bring a ton of peace and stability to your financial life, because when these emergencies happen, and they inevitably will, at least you won't also be stressing about your finances in addition to dealing with whatever the emergency is about. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.